We're going to get started. I'd like to welcome everybody to our wintry mixed January meeting for the Central Vermont Regional Planning Commission. I appreciate that all of you have brought yourself out on a night with not great weather, and we're not going to have a full house. We may or may not have quorum, but we are going to proceed. But probably not run until 9 o'clock. I doubt that, because I'm sure all of you are sort of wondering what it's doing out there and what your drive home is going to be like. Bonnie, do we have any adjustments to the agenda?
Not unless we axe things for the meeting.
Okay.
But no new items.
Okay. So we will start as we normally do with introductions. I'm Julie Potter. I'm from East Montpelier. I'm chair of the commission.
Bonnie Woninger, staff.
Mike Shirling, and Secretary of Commerce and Community Development.
Alan Quackenbush, Duxbury.
Don LaHaye, Waitsfield.
Jack Hawley, East Montpelier, alternate.
Ron Crowell, Middlesex.
Melissa Seifert, Marshfield.
Jerry D'Amico, Roxbury.
Bill Aaron, Worcester.
Steve Lotspeech, Waterbury.
Claire Rock, staff.
Jonathan Delevrier, staff.
Bob Warnick, Berlin.
Amy Hornblass, Cabot.
Lee Catania, Orange.
Nancy Chartrand, staff.
Okay. We were just
You know, so you get, open the slider a little bit.
Okay. We just mentioned adjustments to the agenda, given what the weather's like, Bonnie. Can we put the Act 250 stuff off for another meeting?
Yes.
So tonight, we'll just focus on Secretary Shirling's discussion with us and the commissioner and the survey, and we'll defer the rest of it. So we don't keep you out too late. Is there anybody here who's got public comments that they want to make? Not hearing any, then we will move forward, although before we turn everything over to Secretary Shirling, I would like to welcome our newest staff member, who is Jonathan, I'm going to try and get this right, Delabruere?
Very close.
Okay. Jonathan has just started with the Regional Planning Commission, and he's picking up the emergency management portfolio, and we are all delighted to have you, and I'm sure your new colleagues are delighted to have you too.
Yes, thank you.
Well, welcome very much. Okay. We get the opportunity tonight to hear from Secretary Michael Shirling from the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, and he's got some things to share with us about state economic initiatives, and we'll,
Thanks for having me.
if you want,
Okay,
can
Does
you?
it work for you to stay here?
Then
Okay.
it works.
All right, I'll just stay here. Thanks for having me. I will not, I'll plan not to take the hour. I'll stay as long as you would like to chat. And my plan is to just do a brief overview of the agency and where the administration's coming from in terms of economic development, some of Vermont's challenges, the opportunities. None of this is going to sound shocking to you, most likely, given the nature of the work that you do here on the commission. But primarily have an opportunity to make this interactive. So you can ask whatever you'd like of us and what we've got going, and we'll kind of go from there. No surprise that as the last 2 years, as we've engaged throughout Vermont with businesses and communities, the number one challenge to growing our economy is actually population. It's the ability to put workforce into jobs throughout Vermont. We're running at about a 2.7% unemployment, which is beyond full employment. And that is not an unusual circumstance in any place that's not an urban area in the United States. So this is not a Vermont-specific trend. Any place that's non-urban is suffering from a loss of population over the last couple of decades, and generally an aging population as well. Vermont is now the second oldest state in the nation, which creates some challenges for workforce as well. In addition to that, or directly related to that, you've all seen in the bills and fees and things that you get to operate government at every level. those things have grown over time, and they haven't grown at the same rate, certainly since the recession and even before that, as wages have grown. So affordability remains a challenge, again, not only in Vermont, but in non-urban areas around the United States. Also not a surprise, especially as you're going through planning exercises, to hear that operating a state that's the size of ours, 626,000 people roughly, which is roughly the size of a mid-sized US city. City of Baltimore or Boston is the same size. And delivering everything that a state has to deliver with that population and that economic footprint is challenging. The city of Baltimore or Boston does not have to deliver everything that the state of Vermont has to deliver. So there are challenges to being the size that we are. At the same time, if you flip that script, and the opportunities sort of drive from the same things that are also challenges. It's an opportunity to have a state that's 626,000 people. Would it be great to have a few tens of thousands more? We believe, yes, it would be helpful to grow at a modest clip to be able to fill jobs and ensure that we can do everything necessary to grow the economy. But our overall scale is also an opportunity. We've got a 230-plus year history of innovation, which is a story that's not often told, but the number of inventions that were made here, from various agricultural implements to the first commercial wind turbine in the United States to the microchips that sent the Apollo missions to the moon. There are a variety of things, really a list too long to create, that have their origins here in Vermont, and that level of innovation and perseverance and the quality of the workforce that we have really is legendary outside Vermont. When you go, when Vermonters who have gone elsewhere report back that they have applied for a job or they're looking to do something, the fact that they're from Vermont really is a leg up, because we've got legendary workforce that has that that innovative nature to it. So there are a variety of other opportunities as well, but I'm not going to. I'm going to try to abbreviate this so that I don't keep you here till 9, because I can talk a lot. The agency of so state government has agencies and departments. Agencies typically have multiple departments inside them. Agencies are led by secretaries and departments are led by commissioners. So just so you have that primer, it's a really confusing system. I say usually. The Agency of Education, for example, has no departments, and the Department of Labor is not within an agency. So it sort of depends. But that's generally the way it's laid out. Within the Agency of Commerce, we have the Department of Economic Development, the Department of Housing and Community Development, and the Department of Tourism and Marketing. We also have some other ancillary components that are bolted in there, from historic preservation to the Center for Geographic Services, which is co-located with us, and a variety of other things. If you think of the economy and commerce and community development as the supply side of the equation, state government's about a $6 billion annual enterprise. $1.6 billion goes to education, $2.5 billion goes to human services, and about 37 million goes to economic development through the agency within those 3 departments. That includes federal and state programs and all of the pass-through grants that come out to regional planning commissions, regional development corporations, and all of the variety of nonprofits that also do economic development and community development work that are funded through the agency. That total is $37 million. If I were to display a pie chart for you of our relative size relative to state government and or just human services or just education, you can't see the sliver on that pie chart. That's not a pitch for $2.5 billion in economic development marketing. It just gives you a sense of the supply side versus the demand side of that investment. That's not a criticism, it's just an observation. So 2 years ago, new administration, this happens every few years, of course, and what typically happens is there's this sort of wholesale undertaking to take a fresh look at everything that happens within an organization. That's not actually what we did in economic development and in community development or in tourism and marketing. What we actually did was I arrived to a desk that was full of reports and surveys and white papers and things that informed strategy. And it became apparent that a tremendous amount of legwork had been done over the course of the previous few years, or even going back a decade. There was an enormous amount of information from which to derive strategy. So all we did was go back 3 years, dust off all of those reports and surveys, white papers and things, put them into a database, and pull out the common threads that indicated where we should go to grow the economy and make our communities more vibrant, to grow tourism visits, to do all the things that are in the areas of focus for the agency. And we came out with, without digging, we didn't go deep into drawers to find out what had fallen behind the drawers, to go underneath the dresser. We just looked at the things that were immediately accessible. We found 143 reports that informed strategy that were only 36 months old. Didn't even go back beyond 36 months. We pulled out the 10 key things that were in those reports, and then we held some engagement sessions, both with our partners, with the community at the State House, and with legislators, and then internally with staff. And we culled those down to 7. We took those 7, and we ended up with 5, with 2 of those 7 being nested inside the others. These 5 core things that inform what it is we do are the layer below the governor's 3 priorities, which are economic development, affordability, and protecting the most vulnerable. Those are the instructions that we got before we were even sworn in January of 17, in a pre-cabinet meeting in December of 16. The governor was very clear. These are the guiding principles for the next couple of years. We want the decisions that are made to be made with a lens that takes into account those 3 priorities. So then, subservient to that, we came up with the core operating goals for the agency. These are not going to sound like rocket science to you. It took 143 reports to get there. Tell the story of Vermont. Illuminate the vibrancy of our communities, our businesses, our educational assets, our healthcare assets. Tell the story beyond just the things that Vermont's known for. What's Vermont's #1 export? I do this in every room. I love this. Maple syrup is the #1 answer. So if you were on, what's that show that's on in the middle of the day there with the... Used to be Richard Dawson back in the day.
Yeah, Family Feud.
Family Feud. If you're on Family Feud, that's the answer that would get you the most number of points. The joke answer that people give, it's young people. That's not our #1 export.
Pretty close though.
#1 export actually is microchips. Technology is 25% of our economy. And that can be everything from innovative agricultural products and things to actual microelectronics. So technology is at the top of that list. So just tell that story. Tell the story of all the really interesting and vibrant things that are happening in our communities. That's the first piece. Deploy a 21st century workforce, that's the second piece. And that requires constant, ongoing job training and sort of reacclimatizing people to all the things that are changing on at such a fast pace in the 21st century. Ensure housing for all. We have spent many years focused on affordable housing with a capital A and trying to tackle that cross-section of housing, but arguably in many communities to the detriment of looking at an array of housing opportunities that are necessary in order to recruit and retain people to live in those communities. You really need an array of options for folks. So we're focused on trying to bring a variety of housing either back on the market or to build net new units over the last couple of years. And one of the signature events from the first half of the last biennium was passage of a $35 million housing bond that's designed to leverage $100 million in total investment. And actually we're on target for that $35 million to leverage far more than that. In the first half of that spending, it's on target to leverage almost twice the private investment that it was originally anticipated to leverage, which is a great story. Create vibrant regional economies and ecosystems is the next thing. We've got 251 towns. All of them have a key piece of driving Vermont's future, but not all of them want to have the same piece, nor should all of them have the same piece. We don't need 251 downtowns. We don't need 251 communities who have chosen to be just residential. There are communities in Vermont that have chosen that they just want to be residential. They don't want to have even a gas station or a corner store. They want a residential tax base, and that is their piece of the puzzle as they see it. And that's fine. Identifying what the identity is for those 251 towns and helping them to achieve those goals so that they're part of a regional ecosystem is our fourth goal. And if you were to map jobs in Vermont, there are 10 places where you would see a spike, and you could name them off the top of your head. Burlington, St. Albans, Rutland, Middlebury, Montpelier, Springfield, Bennington, Brattleboro, Hartford, St. Johnsbury. I'm going to leave a couple out, but you know where I'm going with this. If you were to map around those areas a 20, 30, and 40-minute drive, you would encapsulate all 251 towns. And of course, some of them fall into job sheds for multiple locations, but you'd capture everything. So if you think of things in terms of 10 general ecosystems, in order to attract and retain population, which is our number one challenge right now, ensuring that those 10 ecosystems have everything necessary for people to feel comfortable living there, from great landscapes to agriculture to healthcare, education, entertainment, arts and culture, all the components, and of course jobs, all the components necessary in order to attract and retain population to want to live there. So that fourth piece is trying to shepherd as many resources to municipalities and to regions so that they can build the ecosystem necessary to remain vibrant. And then the final thing is to accelerate business growth and recruitment, which is largely in the wheelhouse of the Department of Economic Development. And that is, as it sounds, about 80% of our effort is in growing Vermont's existing businesses, and it's really closer to 85 or 90% of the effort. And then we have a couple of folks that are working on business recruitment to try to help companies that want to locate here, but also to help existing Vermont companies attract supply chain components that are helpful to them. So if you're in Rutland and you're making jet engines, go figure. Most of Vermont, when I go into other rooms, I say, do we make jet engines in Vermont? We do, in Rutland. But a lot of people don't know that. A lot of our young people in particular don't know that, and that's one of the challenges to illuminating that vibrancy. But they may need XYZ component, and it's beneficial to Vermont's business ecosystem to have that available in close proximity versus going to Connecticut or somewhere else to get it. So we may work to attract a piece of that supply chain. And that's just an example. It could be in a variety of different sectors. So that's the 80,000 foot view of what we're working on, and then there are literally hundreds of various programs and initiatives that intersect that, actually too many. One of the things that we're trying to do is try to unify the effort and the investment so that we're not fragmented and putting $10 here and $10 there instead of $100 here into something that's going to push the needle a little bit further. But that's a long, people refer to state government as turning a battleship or a large ocean liner. It's really turning an armada of ships because there are so many different large components to it. So it takes a little while to do that, to unify that effort. So that's the big overview. Probably makes sense for me to turn it to you now, and I can elaborate on any section of that or particular programs or initiatives or sort of future thinking in whatever direction you'd like to go.
Don?
In growing the population, are you looking at infrastructure?
Yes.
And how you can keep up the rate?
Great point. One of the things, so I remember I mentioned we went from 10 to 7 to to 5? Great question. Infrastructure is nested inside the vibrant regional economies and ecosystems. And the reason it's nested there is we don't have, in commerce, we don't have primary responsibility for infrastructure, but we advocate for infrastructure, everything from broadband to bridges and roads, et cetera. So we nested it in there because we don't have the levers to directly pull, but we can talk with the Department of Public Service and the Agency of Transportation and others that do the infrastructure components to try to help that piece of the puzzle get pushed forward.
I have a similar question, I guess, as Dawn, about, you talk about industry, Jet Angela, transportation. And you, as I say, you mentioned it, because one of the problems with some of Vermont is, I don't want to say highways, but be honestly, if you're a little out of town, you're on a road that may be not great for transportation, and people are really, that's a disadvantage.
I grew up in Vermont. I am well aware that you can't get there from here. It's not necessarily a specific subset because it's really in the infrastructure component, but in the section that's around workforce, activating that workforce in part is about having good transportation options. And we talk with retail or tourism operators in particular who have challenges getting their workforce to work on an ongoing basis, or even manufacturers who are coming up with creative solutions to bus people from one place to another because that infrastructure just isn't well built out because we're small. That analogy of mid-sized city is a perfect intersection here. You know, if you're in Baltimore or Boston and you got 625,000 or so people, there's a public transportation system to move them around the 20, 30, 40 square miles that is that city. Well, Vermont's 110 miles long and 60 miles wide at its widest point. It's a little bit bigger of a challenge to build those transportation assets. So we are very mindful of that. Those are really elusive answers, unfortunately. But unfortunately, I have more questions about how to do that than I have answers for you.
John?
Hey, so what seems to be somewhat in conflict with your overall philosophy is what's going on with Act 46 across the state, particularly in the rural regions where we anticipate an outcome will be, or if it hasn't already, is shutting down these rural elementary schools. And I use Rochester as an example. They're going to be commuting an hour each way, driving kids an hour each way over Brandon Gap. You know that road in the winter?
I do.
A night like tonight, if kids were staying late at a basketball game or something, they're coming over that gap in a school bus. And it seems to operate in conflict with your vision, as stated, toward growing these and supporting these rural communities when we've lost, the local economies. Dairy's more or less gone in many of these communities. The country stores are closed. And so people are, struggling to hang on to what they got and keep people interested in living in their communities and moving to their communities and keeping the value of their investments, their real estate investments up there, and interest in purchasing real estate in that competition in their communities keeps your property value up. When you shut down elementary schools, and I'm thinking about not only this region, but the Kingdom and more rural parts of Vermont than this, there's less of an attraction for people moving to the state to move to those communities. They're going to move to communities that have good, strong elementary schools for particularly their little kids. They don't want their little kids on buses. And I know it's a separate agency, the Agency of Education, but you do have your weekly meetings. And
Yep.
I'm just curious. I mean, your administration supports the tenets of Act 46 and this move toward shrinking the number of elementary schools. And do you think that's a long-term strategy that is viable in terms of allowing our communities to grow and attract new people rather than consolidating everybody into the bigger communities?
Don't take this particular answer as the governor's position, because, well, for a variety of reasons, because I'm not in the Agency of Education.
Yeah.
But I don't want to defer and just say, well, that's the Agency of Education's problem. We are very mindfully trying to break down any residual barriers of various agencies and the walls and trying to really look at government as a single enterprise. So it's not the right answer to just say, well, it's not our problem. It is. The hard part is, how do you get to a position where you can make investments in growth when so much of the existing spending has to go to schools because of the structure of the way we've got them laid out? Whether that's geography, size, there are all kinds of challenges. There are districts in Vermont that spend more on transporting students than they do on education, because that's just the nature of the way things have shaken out. So it's the transition, I think, that's going to be the hard part. How do you reallocate the $1.6 billion in school spending to do better supports for early child care and learning, to do some better back-end supports for not just college, but for post-high school learning, whether that's trades and re-embracing all the things that can go with that and the great careers that can go with that, but also colleges. It's the transitionary period that's the hard part. What I think the future is a little less bricks and mortar. If we could invest over time in the technology and make that ubiquitous throughout Vermont, so folks have good access, the need to move to a school on a daily basis for education starts to be mitigated. And I think that's the long play, is the future is something different than we have now, but isn't what we're moving to immediately. It's a number of steps. Imagine Vermont being, and I'm just making this up, this is not a policy position, this next piece is not a policy position. Imagine that we've got, because we've only got 626,000 people, we've got the 21st century education system. So you could go to the students on a couple of days a week could go to the public library and interact with the top science, math, art teachers in the state, and it's a completely different paradigm for how we deliver the education. And that's just one idea. But imagine we were able to unlock that, and our teachers could design systems layered on these technologies so that any kid anywhere in Vermont can have access to anything, any content from the university, any content from the technical college.
I think that works at the high school level.
It does.
It's the elementary level I was speaking to, K through 6 or 8.
Yeah, there are even advantages to that kind of a paradigm, but I should have given you my little disclaimer as well. My graduate degree is in education, so I've done a bunch of thinking on this particular topic over the years. It's a really long-winded answer. The bottom line is somehow we've got to make the transition. This transitionary period from what we do now to whatever the future holds is the hard part. And the direct answer from the economic development perspective is, if we shutter schools, which is happening with Act 46, there are infinite opportunities to take those centers of activity in communities and reinvent them into something else, whether those are innovative spaces, incubators for local companies, education spaces, all kinds of different things. And I think what our role is, in commerce in particular, is to help communities identify what those things could be and then figure out how to both plan and then implement those strategies. So it's not a perfect answer. That's what we have at the moment in this time of fluctuation and change.
Bram, and then Amy?
Yes, I was reading in the Wall Street Journal this week. There's a little article that says Vermont is the new Florida, in a good way, and it talks about how Vermont is the #1 state per capita that people are moving to. It defies the Northeast region. and that a lot of families are moving to Vermont. And to speak to what John was saying, I'm sure you have done great work. I was a little uneasy with your focusing on the large areas for, it sounds like, and I'm sure if we went through the numbers, a lot of the investment would be in Chittenden County and in the big cities. And speaking as somebody who represents a small town, I think that there is opportunity that is being untapped in terms of pushing the story of how of the lifestyle of living in these small towns. And I think what John was saying is it's short-sighted in a sense to do certain things and focus energies, and I think that your overall vision of this sort of these microeconomies, I think that you might consider considering investing resources in really small towns, and I think that there might be a bang for the buck for that.
It's a great point, and we actually do. When you look at the Vermont Training Program, Vermont Employment Growth Incentive, our Community Development Block Grants, our Northern Border Regional Grants, which are 4 of our larger programs in commerce, both the geographic diversity and the diversity of the size of the towns and the types of projects is incredibly diverse, because we're very mindful that just investing in Rutland or Middlebury or Burlington is not a viable alternative. Otherwise, you've got other towns and municipalities that become a draw on the ability of the larger municipalities to grow. So you can't just invest in those. I should be clear that when I talk about those regional ecosystems, the only reason they're identified with that city or large town at the center is just because that's where there's an aggregation of jobs by just the way they've naturally evolved. Our strategy is to help all 251 towns, a piece at a time, be a vibrant piece of that ecosystem, and that's what those are identified for. We're very mindful that identifying particular ecosystems comes with a hazard that it might look like you're trying to invest in the center of it only, but it really is more about it goes to transportation as well. They're drawn in a way where there's got to be a reasonable commuter shed around in a particular area, and many of them are geographically isolated. If you look at this map that the Center for Geographic Information was built for us on commuter sheds, there's dark areas. They're not giant because we're not out west, but they're very large mountains and bodies of water that separate. So that some of the commuter sheds are just not possible. You can't get from one point to another.
Amy?
And I'm sorry, just, what did you just say the map was made by, it's kept in the center? For
in state government, we have something called the Vermont Center for Geographic Information, VCGI. It's a great asset, a team of people that work on data visualization, mapping. They do everything from helping us improve water runoff and show where, how to clean up the various basins with the water programs, to avoiding, in some cases, the need to dig for archaeological work on a project, because they can use imaging done from drones and aircraft to tell us the probability that the Earth was disturbed over time. It's fascinating stuff. And we happen to have them right in state government.
Oh, great, thank you. And my actual question is about the 21st century workforce. I'm wondering why we're not focusing more on agriculture when we're training the youth for tomorrow. You know, if that's what Vermont is, you know, our label, our story that we're telling the country about ourselves. And
we are in part.
That our workforce is really popular around the country. And I know our contractors get hired out a lot of times from Vermont because Vermont workers, you know.
Right.
And I know that the kids nowadays, we're giving them all this technology in school. We're trying to train them for IT and all this stuff. But the more and more gadgets they have at home and at school, any employer will tell you that is not helping them be a good workforce. So I'm wondering if maybe laying off the gadgets, because it's really... it was that agricultural work ethic, the skills you got from putting that tractor back together, you know, whatever you had to do, making it work, that's what gave us our ingenuity and our strong workforce.
True.
And I wonder if we should maybe spend more on that. And that would help the smaller communities, the smaller schools, the you know, because
I
that's
think
where
there's
the
still
ag
parts of my
is.
grandparents' house that I took apart that haven't been put back together again when I was a kid. That one's well outside of our wheelhouse in terms of the gadgets, but you are looking at one of the parents who, my kids didn't have cell phones until they were in college and could pay for them themselves because get outside and.
But a lot of
We
education
were evil, by
monies-
the way, we're the evil parents.
Yeah, I'm talking about the educational money, you know, that, like the investment that your office is doing, you know, to prepare this 21st century. I'm wondering if you're including agriculture in that to the extent that maybe.
We are, you know, one of the things
Should
that's
be.
funded through the agency is the Sustainable Jobs Fund, which has a very successful farm to table and really integrating, not just farming and agriculture, but integrating that with the rest of the economy, which is a model for the nation. Vermont is, this is again, that's sort of the tale of two sides of the same coin. Vermont doesn't have a single sector that dominates others. That is in some cases, it becomes a disadvantage because we don't have that one rallying point. It used to be agriculture, it's not anymore. At the same time, that actually creates stability and health, and the diversity of the employment and what we do in Vermont is actually a healthy thing because you're not reliant on one thing. The dairy, for example, if we were reliant on dairy like we were 50 or 60 years ago, we'd be in big trouble right now, where you just dipped below 700 farms for the first time in history. So that's sort of the landscape there. The other thing that's happening in agriculture is we're very mindful that there are things that are going to be disrupted as a result of automation, artificial intelligence, robotics. That's coming, and in some cases that's here. Even in dairy now, automated milking parlors are really fascinating and helpful pieces of machinery for the farms that can afford to deploy them. So we're trying to mindfully ensure that we've got this vast array of things that that contribute to Vermont's economy. And of course, you've got the entire Agency of Agriculture that's focused on that. So we got a different model than in some other places, and certainly the mid-sized cities do. We've got a whole other agency that's focused exclusively on that piece. Where was I going with that? It's getting late. I was going to, we want to be mindful not to shuttle too many workers into places where in the not too distant future we know that technology will disrupt them. So because we've got, again, that's advantage, disadvantage. We don't have enough workers, so we don't want to push them into places where they're going to eventually be replaced with technology. We want to ensure that they've got the skill sets to be able to do a variety of different things. I'm not sure it's directly on point with your.
Yeah.
I mean,
We seem to be getting away from the trades, I mean,
Yeah, that's-
as a country.
As a country,
And
to
so
our
there's
detriment.
there's a dearth of skilled, licensed,
Yes.
trades people. And
If I had to
actually
do
there's
over again,
huge
I wouldn't be
demand.
sitting here.
Yeah, same here.
Lee?
Yeah, New York State is moving towards 2 years of free community college. Has there been any talk of that?
It's 4 years.
Yes. New York's not alone. We are having the same kinds of conversations. Again, we're at that very difficult inflection point where the pivot to that, it dovetails directly into, now how do we implement Act 46? How do we reduce the cost structure for K through 12 so we can deliver high quality, but invest, not reduce spending, invest that large swath of spending in that kind of back-end investment, but also in the early childhood care and learning, because at that front end, all the studies are the educational outcomes are better if you can invest more at the front end also. So it's the core challenge is how do you invest that $1.6 billion in the best way to achieve a wider swath of outcomes from cradle all the way to career, and potentially subsidizing a couple of years of college or trade school or
Right.
whatever.
But in New York, you then have to stay in the state and work. And, I keep hearing that, young people to move out of the state, and that would be a good way of keeping them in, too.
It would. We just have to figure out how, we're stuck in this, the cycle of if we don't grow, we can't spend. If we can't spend, so we can't grow. Somewhere you've got to break that cycle. And that's where we're at right now, is trying to figure out how to make that transition to growth. And we've got to make some investments in figuring out how to grow the population, grow the workforce, and take the cross-section of dollars we do spend and make some tough choices in the interim. And it goes to the Act 46 question. It's really hard for government to do short-term pain for long-term gain. It's almost impossible. We're terrible at that. We're terrible at long play, whether it's state, federal, or local. I've been in local government for almost 30 years. It's a hard thing to do, but that's what we're trying to figure out, is how do you make the long play, even though there's going to be some short-term pain that goes with that. I don't know if we'll get there, candidly, because it's really hard.
Ron?
Yeah, you talk about some of the innovations of Vermont, and I think, when we go visit, we're originally from Jersey, when we go back to Jersey, visit the kids, and some of the stuff makes the news, the national news. It's like they don't know Vermont exists. For instance, like, there was, when saw some of the quick shots on one of the TV news, so innovative. These kids in California are growing their own stuff in the schools and eating it. Well, my wife happens to be involved with recycling that, and we look at it and say, they've been doing that in Vermont for years. Nobody knows it. Nobody knows it.
Because California, it's marketing.
Yeah, it's marketing. That's my.
So one of our asks, I don't exactly know the size that it's going to be yet. The governor's going to do this. The state is inaugural on Thursday, and part of I think what he's going to announce is his decision on how much marketing or recruitment and storytelling he'd like to invest this year. By way of example, we spent $3 million in state funds on tourism marketing for a $2.8 billion industry. Maine spends $15 million. We're last in New England. We're pretty close to last in the United States in our investment in storytelling and marketing. The reason you see that story from California is they spend hundreds of millions of dollars to get that story out. That is something we have to invest in. We don't, people, particularly in Western culture, don't do anything that they haven't been told about. You drive a car or a truck that you know about because someone told you the story of that car or truck. The clothing you wear largely is a result of someone telling you that story. It may be an in-person thing at a local store, it may be something you saw on TV, it may be something you saw on the internet. But it really is about storytelling. We make decisions based on what we know. But no one's going to make decisions about Vermont unless they know. So we've got to make some investment to do that. What we found, here's a fascinating thing from the last session. The Senate and then eventually the entire legislature passed something called the Remote Worker Bill. It's not a perfect piece of legislation. It's designed to incentivize people who work for companies outside Vermont to come here by paying them money to help offset their cost of relocation. Is it perfect? No. We argued for something quite different. But what the really fascinating thing happened, they invested $125,000 in this budget cycle. It's a very modest investment. $250,000 in the coming cycle and $125,000 in the third year. It got so much traction. We got over 1 billion, with a B, media impressions. 1 billion people, well, it's not necessarily 1 billion people. It could be 100 million people that saw it 10 times. But a billion sets of eyeballs at various times saw stories about this particular initiative. 3,000 people signed up to be on the list to get information, about this particular program to try to take advantage of it. And 10,000 people signed up for our Think Vermont newsletters to hear more about Vermont. That was one story. Imagine if we had dollars to go out and actually place all of the cool things that are happening in your communities, in the businesses that surround you, the things that our local chambers and development corporations and planning commissions are working on. If we could get those stories out, imagine the number of eyeballs we could have. Marketing actually works.
So are people actually taking advantage of the program, moving here and paying income tax here now?
They are.
And has it exceeded the investment yet? Are we getting there?
We've already gotten a six-fold return on the investment in advertising collateral alone. The estimate is we've gotten about $3.5 million in ad equivalent based on the publicity that goes with this. And it's not just on this program. People are putting their eyeballs on all kinds of things that are happening in Vermont as a result of the publicity that went with this program. So unintended consequence, but interesting story about how once you get a compelling narrative out there, how powerful it can be.
Steve?
I'm interested in your thoughts about workforce housing. We've talked a lot about economic development, which is great. I've worked with community development block grants for about 25 years, and I think the agency's done a great job with affordable housing, I guess, with the big A, and a lot of great examples in our region. I see, especially in either resort communities or communities that are really dependent on a service workforce, that a lot of those employees struggle to find affordable housing, and it's often very substandard housing, what's available on in the market. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that and what the agency's doing, either in partnership with companies. I know So Mountain Resort has done some innovative work, but I'd be interested what you're seeing and promoting in the agency more on the market side of housing to try to solve some of these problems.
Great question. So to start with, the $35 million housing bond, the housing team has been trying to find creative ways to get more, to unlock some of those dollars for private developers. So folks that aren't intimately familiar with housing, the vast majority of public housing investment goes to nonprofits that develop that housing. They're very complicated projects, and they're really good at pulling off those projects. But where we haven't invested a lot is in trying to help offset the cost of development to private developers to develop the kinds of housing that you're talking about. So we're exploring those investments both in direct projects that are building ground up, but also some creative things around rental housing rehabilitation. Did a pilot project in Rutland on rental housing rehab to try to get underutilized housing stock back on the market. And then stay tuned on Thursday. There'll likely be, either Thursday or in the budget address later in the month, there will be another announcement of another initiative that's creative to try to get, to reactivate more housing that's not useful for that workforce right now. It's either substandard or it's completely off the market because it requires too much investment. And I should just note, one of the reasons that these subsidies are necessary is that the cost of development in Vermont is so high that almost everything you build today is upside down as soon as it's built. So whether that's a private residence or multi-unit complex or something done by one of our housing developers, the cost to build you can't get back out in many instances. So in that affordability realm, one of the things you'll hear about this session is the Act 147 work that the legislature's undertaken around Act 250 to try to modernize Act 250. And the administration's position is our landscapes are critical to keeping Vermont what it is and to attracting and retaining population. At the same time, if we can't build either housing or allow our businesses to expand in a mindful way, we're going to continue to stymie the growth where we want it. So the position is, let's try to figure out a way to relax regulation and oversight in places where we want development to occur, downtowns, village centers, corridors, industrial parks that already have designations, places like that. And at the same time, maybe you're looking at enhancing the regulation and making it more difficult to build on ridge lines and next to streams and in places that's going to interfere with the natural landscape. And the reason for that's twofold. Not only does it make sense to develop in compact areas because that's where a lot of millennials want to live, and increasingly folks that are retiring want to live. They want to live in walkable distance to village centers and things like that. That's not exclusively the answer. There are folks that are moving here that want to be in the 10-acre parcels and are adopting farms and things like that. So I'm not saying that's the only thing, but that is a consistent theme. At the same time, when we build new roads and we go out further into undeveloped areas, we're immediately upside down in our ability to maintain those things. So a mile of telephone line, a mile, although we don't really do that anymore, so telephone's a bad example, but having to build broadband or sewer or whatever it is, roadway alone, is more expensive to maintain than you're going to generate in tax revenue to maintain it. So there's a fiscal component to that as well when you look at smart development patterns.
Claire?
I was curious about the what you envision the future of kind of Airbnb in Vermont is, considering people are now turning to that as a way to just make more money off of that apartment and no longer
Right.
making it available to maybe people that would need that housing. And I was curious on what you envision or what you foresee the legislature doing about that growing market.
It's a really complicated question because it is disruptive in a variety of ways. It's disruptive to our hotel and lodging property industry, the bed and breakfasts and all the folks that are in that arena. It's disruptive to housing stock because if you can make more money renting it on weekends than you can as a full-time rental, it's taking a piece of property off the market. Finding the answer and the balance, I think, is going to take a little while because we've got to get some experience with how this system works, how it's going to shake out. Much like building 10 hotels in one area in Vermont, it's not going to work because you don't have the demand. And where is that supply-demand balance for the sharing economy with homes? And we don't know the answer to that yet. So what we're talking about in terms of general framing is there's a difference between one of you wanting to rent a room that you have that's a spare room in your house, or when you go away for the weekend, renting out your house on Airbnb, or renting it for, I think in the federal tax code, it's like 14 nights you can rent without having a tax implication. I'm not a tax attorney, so don't quote me on that, but it's something along those lines. That's quite different than I go out and buy a number of properties with the intent of making them full-time Airbnb or sharing economy rentals. And it's trying to figure out where that balancing point is and how to regulate. Where the right regulation is for the folks that are doing it as a hobby or side income, which could be important to Vermont's economy, the folks that are doing it as a commercial enterprise, which is also potentially important to the economy but has other consequences and potentially the need for other regulatory overlays. And that's more question than answer. We don't know the answer yet, but those are the conversations that legislators and our housing teams and folks in housing safety and fire safety are going to have to unpackage over the next months and years. Nothing's simple anymore.
Bonnie, did you have a question?
I have one thing to alert you on and a question. The first one is there was some conversation about transportation, public transit, and employers. And yesterday, the Green Mountain Transit had to give Sugar Bush and the Mad River Valley the heads up that very shortly for fiscal year 20, it's likely that transit service in the valley is going to be suspended because we simply can't afford to support the transit system as it currently exists. So when you think about those innovative things, we need an innovative strategy, or at least a different strategy for public transit funding, so that we can support our employers. There are other routes that will also be suspended. In our region, the Plainfield Health Center and Barry Hospital Hill will be suspended as of April 1. The other ones need to go through a public vetting process, but the numbers aren't necessarily there, and they can't afford their own system. For something like Sugar Bush, that's a pretty serious implication for them.
Yeah, I imagine this is the first that I've heard of those alterations to the system.
You might be hearing more from
I imagine we will.
So, heads up.
I appreciate the heads up. I don't have an answer for that one.
The second question relates, the actual question, that one was more of a heads up, relates to housing. When I look at the population statistics out a few years, we're concentrated now on looking at the youth population, concentration in downtowns, village centers with our housing. But if you look at those statistics as our population wave comes through, we have a growing concern that folks who are in the rural area now, aging in their homes, even if we're not terribly old at the moment, are going to be stuck there unable to sell because there'll be no one to purchase, and we'll end up with real poverty in rural areas among our seniors and a degrading housing stock out there. Is the agency, through Housing and Community Affairs, beginning to look at that issue and think a little further in the future?
We are, we don't have particular policy initiatives to address that yet, other than the pilot projects around rental rehab would apply not just to our compact settlement patterns, but really anywhere. It's going to be interesting. This sort of goes to macroeconomic cycle. You see these ebbs and flows of aggregation of people in cities and then a return to the country. And we're actually starting now to see indications that people are going from cities into more rural landscapes. So if that trend, if that's more than just a blip, things will be in reasonably good shape if, going back to the infrastructure question, we can continue to maintain the right roads, we can continue to make incremental progress on broadband, and ensure that we've got, again, those, this goes to the vibrant economies and ecosystems. Someone's more likely to be 20 minutes away on that rural parcel if they're only 20 minutes away from a movie or a library or whatever it is. So the macro view does take that into account, while we don't have specificity with in terms of policy ideas on what to do with each one of those things, because some of it is a little bit outside of our control. Hopefully it also goes to marketing. If you tell a good story about what it's like to live on a 10-acre parcel instead of in an apartment in downtown Rutland or Montpelier or Barrie, there are going to be people who choose that because they know that they're drawn to it. If you can't tell the story, no way to draw them to it.
We've never cheered harder for climate refugees.
Yes.
Probably
We'll be long gone before we're waterfront property, but
Yes.
maybe someday.
But as the Boston area fills up with water, perhaps they'll leapfrog to Vermont.
Yeah, it's the big. If there's a refugee wave that's coming, it's cost.
Yes, it is.
The cities are expensive, and so I mentioned the remote worker thing, and while it's not a perfect piece of policy because it addresses one sliver of what we can do, it's also an interesting sliver, because if you can make Boston or Seattle money and live in Vermont, imagine the contribution to our small towns when people are living there, even if they take some modest pay cut for being here. That's still that's a nice infusion into the local economy.
Claire?
I was just curious on what kind of implications do you see might impact Vermont from the government shutdown?
Press forward.
So far, there's wood in there somewhere. There's wood products. So far, no substantive impacts. There are ancillary impacts, and you'll hear some of them I heard some of them on VPR. Certainly the federal employees are not getting paid is not helpful, because that trickles into all kinds of different things. The longer it goes, the more interesting it's going to be. It'll be a little while before we start to see federal programs that provide subsidies impacted, but it's not that far off. So I knock on wood because no matter who's in Washington, they will eventually come to their senses and come to an answer. They just have to find it. And maybe they're getting to it right now. I don't know what time the address was, but if there's one thing that all this polarization and everything that's happening on a national level is illustrated is the resiliency of the institutions that we have. What the framers built really works, as long as you don't catastrophically break it. And we've had some very interesting stuff going on, and it hasn't broken. So.
So I think maybe on that cheerful note.
That's totally glass is half full. Probably 3/4 full on that note.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're exuding some optimism here, and we're glad to hear it. I think that we will call it an evening. I'd like to thank you very much for coming to talk with us.
I'll actually leave you with these words of wisdom, which are not mine. They come from a gentleman on the West Coast. But when we look at trying to create policy, the biggest hurdle is that there's two things humans do not like: the status quo and change. So if you can get through that.
Well, we can agree on that.
Exactly.
Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
I'll stick around, but I gotta drive in this freezing rain, so I'm going.
Break the trail for.
I think we will, I mean, if you want to stay and hear some more stuff, we can do that, but otherwise we can wrap up.
Do we have a quorum? Happy to make a motion to early to inclement weather.
I think that, so Don's made a motion for us to adjourn. Do we have a second?
Second.
Seconded by Lee. All in favor, say aye. Aye.
Can we do the minutes? Do we have a quorum?
You do have a quorum.
We do have a quorum.
Why can't we do the minutes? That's a 2-minute.
I'm going to turn
Drive
to
safely.
Bob as our parliamentarian here, and can
We have, but you know what? We're not really that strict on this stuff.
Would you like to reopen the meeting?
Spoken like a true parliamentarian.
One more time.
I think the chair can entertain a motion.
Are you going to hold us back just briefly? Okay. Okay, so Don has withdrawn the motion for the moment.
I didn't withdraw the second, but the second.
Means you're a bad guy.
Is it okay with you? We do the minutes quickly and then we'll adjourn. Okay, so does anybody have any corrections or comments they wanted to make on the meeting minutes from December 11th?
I'll make a motion that we approve the minutes so we can get out to the discussion.
Jeff had a correction about attendance.
So I think the one thing that we did have was Jack noted that it shows that he was here and I was not, and it was the other, or something like that, and it was the other way around? Okay. But with that correction, you've moved to approve. Do we have a second?
Well, I noticed an error. I just
Yes, I did.
Hold on, there was some conversation before the second.
Yeah.
Yes,
Sorry,
Melissa.
I think I noticed an error on line 16. Claire Rock 2 provided an overview. I just,
Yes, on page 2, line 6.
oh, sorry, page 2, line 16 of the minutes.
Did you two provide that?
2 provided.
She might have. Take out the two? That's Claire.
Okay, so we've got that, we have that editorial correction.
We have an English
Anything else? Okay, so we have a motion by Jerry, it was seconded by
Bill,
Bill?
Aaron.
Bill, Aaron. Any further discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
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 Abstaining, I
Opposed?
wasn't
I'm
here, so.
abstaining as well.
Okay, so we've got 2 abstentions, Ron and Melissa. But other than that, it's
Actually, if they abstain, you can't have a vote.
because.
You don't have a quorum.
You are
You
allowed
can
to
vote, you can vote even though
You
you're
are allowed
not
to
here.
vote.
There's,
Even if I'm not here?
Yes.
Yes, okay, then I,
All right, in order.
We're looking to
Yeah,
you, Ron,
here.
just a little
I'll-
pressure.
I'll vote. Approve, because I
Okay.
heard
You
a
can vote
correction,
against
so.
them.
No. I'm not gonna vote against him. What do you want?
no, you can't abstain, you can abstain.
If you abstain, we don't have a quorum for the vote. You can vote for, you can vote against.
I'll vote, I read, I'll vote for him.
Okay.
Good man.
So,
But
Ron
you
and
know I
Melissa
wasn't
decided they
here, I'm
are
doing
voting
this
for, is
thinking
that's what I
get out
heard
of
you
it.
say, is
Yeah.
that correct? Okay, so, motion passes. Don, would you like to do us the honors?
I'll present the motion before it gets to the actual
Yes,
time when we're supposed to.
yes. So, did I just hear, Don, that you moved to adjourn?
Yes.
And we had a second from,
I'll resubmit my
Re-
second.
all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
It was raining at my house.
Abstentions. Thank you all very much for coming tonight. We'll see you in February. Drive home safely, please.
thank you.
Thank you all. February, we don't know what the weather's gonna be. You never know. You never know.